Welcome back to Hinduism. In part 3, we're going to look at the Hindu scriptures called the Upanishads. The Upanishads were composed in what's called the late Vedic period. This is a later period in the history of India after the early Vedic period. The early Vedic period had begun with the migration of the Indo-Aryans from Central Asia to South Asia. The Indo-Aryan language, culture, and religion continued to spread throughout North India during the late Vedic period. You can see on the map, the region in brown is the approximate cultural sphere of the Aryan kingdoms around 1100 to 500 BCE. During the late Vedic period, the smaller kingdoms and tribal republics that had existed in the early Vedic period began to consolidate into larger kingdoms called Mahajanapadas, and several of the tribal republics were absorbed into these expanding kingdoms. So kingship or monarchy became the main form of government in South Asia. This period also saw the beginnings of towns and cities in South Asia. Previously, the Indus Valley civilization had larger cities along the Sindhu or Indus River, but they were abandoned, and we didn't see a return of civilization until this late Vedic period. The unity of the speech of the Indo-Aryans was disrupted during the late Vedic period. The old Indo-Aryan language they had previously spoken became separated into different dialects, not all of which were that mutually intelligible. So there were multiple Prakrits or dialects spoken in the different kingdoms of the late Vedic period. You can see the names of the kingdoms in black capital letters on the map, such as Kuru, Panchala, Kosala, Videha, and Magadha. It was in the 6th century BCE or thereabouts that the early Upanishads began to be written. The Upanishads emerged out of a larger cultural movement known as the Shramana Movement. This movement began around the 6th century BCE in the Ganges River plain, specifically between the Ganges and Yamuna rivers, an area known as Madhya Desa, or the Middle Country in Sanskrit. This was kind of like the heartland of, at least the cultural heartland of the Indo-Aryan kingdoms of the late Vedic period. The Shramana movement offered an alternative to religion rooted in the Veda. You'll recall that the essence of Vedic religion was sacrifices or other rituals performed by Brahmins or priests to honor the gods. The Shramanas advocated instead practicing a life of renunciation, so renouncing worldly goods and attachments, in order to attain spiritual liberation or salvation. Many of the Shramanas had similar beliefs about the nature of reality and the need for liberation. So belief in karma was widespread among Shramanas of different sects. Karma is the doctrine of action and result, specifically that the kind of action a person performs will affect their current and future experiences, both in this lifetime and in the next lifetime. So for example, if someone is generous and gives away their wealth, they can expect to receive the generosity of others, either in this life or in a future birth. Connected to karma is the doctrine of samsara, which is the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. Most sects of Shramanas believed in reincarnation connected to the idea of samsara, that every living creature can be reborn into a new body, whether human, animal, or otherwise. So someone who's living as a male Brahmin in this incarnation could be reborn as a female kshatriya or noble, or any other type of body in their next life. And the type of rebirth a being will get is based on their past karma. Rebirth can also include bodies that are in heavenly realms, such as the places where the gods live, the devas, or in underworld or hell realms. although each religion has their own particular cosmology or map of the universe, so to speak. And the Shramanas also mostly believed in the possibility of moksha, which could be defined as liberation or freedom. This is referring both to a freedom from the cycle of rebirth in samsara and also to an inner spiritual freedom, which is experienced as bliss and the end of suffering. Moksha is typically conceived of as something that could happen in this life as well as after life. Samsara, even though it involves rebirth and a kind of eternal life, you might say, it's not regarded as a good thing by the Shramana movement. Because with each new birth, there's also going to be new pain, new suffering, and new loss. Even if you have a relatively good rebirth, such as a wealthy person or a high status person who lives a mostly peaceful existence, or even a god or other heavenly being, you're still eventually going to lose that body. You will lose all the relationships and all the things you had in that life. So there's still going to be loss regardless of how you're reborn. Even the gods in this theory are not truly eternal. They last for a long time, such as millions of years, but they're eventually reborn in samsara. Another aspect of samsara that's non-ideal is with each new rebirth, you're confined into one body in one place. So there isn't the same freedom of moksha. Moksha is regarded as a state of complete freedom, both inner and outer. The picture on the right is of a modern Shramana, you might say. The term Shramana is not so common anymore. It was used more historically, closer to the beginning of this movement. Other terms that mean a renunciate or ascetic, someone who renounces all worldly attachments for the sake of salvation, are sannyasin and sadhu. There's also the term yogi, which is someone who practices meditation or other spiritual disciplines as their main focus, and that can overlap with the concept of shramana or sannyasin or sadhu. As mentioned, there are multiple sects of Shramanas, and the Jains, Ajivikas, and Buddhists were not Hindu. The Hindu Shramanas believed in the general doctrines of the Shramana movement, karma, samsara, moksha. However, they retain the view that the Veda is authoritative. So Hindu Shramanas did not reject the Veda or the priests known as Brahmins, unlike the other sects. We're going to talk briefly about the Jains and Ajivikas before returning to the Hindus. The Buddhists will cover in a later series of videos on Buddhism specifically. Jainism may be the oldest of the sects of Shramanas. It was founded by Jina Mahavira, whose name in Sanskrit means conqueror, Jina, great hero, Mahavira. This is actually a title for the founder of the religion, not his given name. He probably lived in the 6th century BCE, possibly extending into the early 5th century BCE. According to Jains, Jina Mahavira is actually not the first or original founder of the religion. They regard it as an eternal teaching or an eternal truth that is continually reintroduced into the world by new teachers after it is forgotten. And according to the traditions and the texts of Jainism, Jina Mahavira was actually raised in a family who practiced a form of the religion already. This may actually reflect some sort of historical fact. Jainism may have its roots in another pre-Vedic or pre-Indo-Aryan religion of South Asia, although that's not known for certain. One of the core doctrines of Jainism is belief in a soul. The soul is conceived as an eternal, formless, that is without perceptible form, shape, or quality, and having pure consciousness. So all it is pure awareness without a body or anything perceptible or even imaginable apart from the consciousness. The way karma is conceived of in Jainism is as an actual dirt or dust-like matter. It's so small it's imperceptible to the eyes. But when a person acts, there's an influx of this matter from the world, and it clings to, sticks to, or attaches itself to the soul, which keeps it weighed down and trapped in samsara. The solution to the problem of karma is to perform tapas or austerities. These are various forms of renunciation, things such as fasting for long periods, not wearing any clothes, exposing yourself to the elements, sitting still for long periods of time, and other types of renunciation. This allows the past karma to be, metaphorically speaking, burned away. Tapas is conceived of as a type of heat that can be used to purify the soul. Tapas is kind of what gets rid of past karma, but in order to solve the problem of samsara with its perpetual loss and suffering, more is required, specifically samadhi or meditation. Meditation involves focusing on one object, theme, or topic for an extended time. So it's conceived as something that creates focus and calm in the mind. For example, you can meditate on the breath or on a syllable, such as Om in Hinduism. In Jainism, samadhi is regarded as preventing or uprooting future karma. So tapas can help you burn away your past karma, but in order to prevent yourself from continually generating new karma, you have to practice meditation. Jainism calls the state of liberation or moksha kevala jnana, or kevala jnana as it would be pronounced today. This literally means aloneness, kevala, knowledge, jnana. The idea is it involves knowledge of the self or soul, that the self or soul is separate from all matters. So that's what the aloneness is referring to. The soul becomes metaphorically alone, not tainted or sullied by these things outside of its genuine nature. Jainism is also renowned for its ethics. It has a strong ethic, for example, of telling the truth or satya, which is one of the reasons why Jain merchants are so prominent in Indian society. They've been regarded as very scrupulous, trustworthy. Another very well-known element of Jain ethics is ahimsa, or non-violence. According to Jainism, because all living creatures that can perform actions are part of samsara, it's always wrong to kill a living creature, including animals. Plants are exempt because they don't perform karma. They're living, but they don't have actions based on willing that generate results. Ahimsa implies vegetarianism in the way that it's interpreted by Jains. So Jain vegetarians do not eat meat or eggs. They do eat dairy products. It's regarded as ethically permissible as long as you get food that's not involving the killing of an animal. So at least in principle, you can milk a cow, make cheese or butter from that, and not actually kill or harm the cow in that process. And as a kind of historical note, dairy products have been very important in the diet in India since its early history, at least since the migration of the Indo-Aryans, because cows were sort of the original foundation of their economy and nutrition. So Jainism is quite distinct from Hinduism, though, in several respects. Even though later Hindus often believed in karma, in samsara, in samadhi or meditation, even in some ethical principles like ahimsa, the Jains reject the Veda, and they reject the authority of the Brahmins or priests. So they have their own clergy that do not have to be born into the Brahmin caste. Monks and nuns in Jainism are their renunciates, people who renounce family, wealth, possessions, pleasures, and comforts for the sake of attaining kevala jnana. And they are the authorities in the religion, and they can be of either gender or of any caste. In addition, Jains do not believe in Brahman or an all-powerful supreme being who's a creator god. They think the universe is eternal and it gets periodically recreated and destroyed, but it has no first cause or main creator. It's more of just a continuous process, ultimately produced by the souls that are trapped there through their ignorance. They do believe in gods or devas, and they sometimes worship them, but the devas are also beings subject to the cycle of samsara. They have karma and are reincarnated and are trapped in samsara just like humans or animals. So the devas can give you blessings in samsara, but they don't have the transcendent knowledge of the jinas or the saints of the religion. So that's who you want to go to in order to attain moksha, or kevala jnana, as they call it. You'll notice on the image on the right a seated figure. This is Jina Mahavira. This is a common style of image in many South Asian religions. Buddhist icons often show the Buddha seated in a similar cross-legged lotus posture. Hindu icons often show Shiva or another god seated in a similar posture. The other details of the iconography differ, but that shows the probability of mutual iconographical influence among South Asian religions. You'll also note the two swastikas below the base of the seated figure of Jina Mahavira. The swastika is a symbol of blessedness, good fortune, or prosperity in Indian religions. The Ajivikas were another important sect of Shramanas in ancient times. They since died out, and knowledge of them is somewhat spotty. We get it from texts of other religions, such as that of the Buddhists. The Ajivikas were believed to have been founded by someone named Makali Gosala in the 5th century BCE, perhaps around 484. He may have been a former student of Jina Mahavira, the founder of Jainism. One of the distinctive doctrines of the Ajivikas is niyati, or fate. This is a belief in hard determinism, that all events are completely caused, and therefore there's no such thing as free will, nor karma as it's ordinarily understood in the Shramana movement. The Ajivikas do believe in samsara, so every living creature is an Atman, or soul, that gets reborn in samsara. However, the nature of the rebirth, whether of high or low status, whether male or female, god, animal, human, hell being, etc., all of that is just determined by past events, not by your current actions. And the souls have a kind of destiny about how many times and in what way they'll be reincarnated until they attain nirvana, which is another word for moksha, or freedom from samsara. The Ajivikas are also noteworthy for their metaphysics, or their philosophy of nature, their physics, depending upon how you interpret it, which is atomistic. The Ajivika theory of atoms is that everything that you can perceive is composed of tiny, eternal, and unsplittable or indivisible atoms that you cannot directly perceive. And these atoms form skandhas, molecule-like aggregates, which then join together into larger objects. There were many other schools of philosophy and different sects that had different theories of nature or of the fundamental nature of reality, but the Ajivikas' somewhat developed and sophisticated atomism influenced that of many other sects and schools, even though they themselves eventually died out. The Ajivikas are called an atheist sect, and the term atheism has a very specific connotation in the context of Indian religion or philosophy. A sect like the Ajivikas, when they're called atheist, that usually means they don't believe in Brahman, or a supreme, all-powerful creator god. If that is the narrow sense of atheism that we're using, then the Jains also count as atheists in that sense, as do the Buddhists. However, the Jains and the Buddhists do believe in many gods and goddesses, or devas, and other types of divine beings. Buddhists, for example, even believe in a Brahma, a creator god, who creates an individual world. Brahma is just not all-powerful or all-knowing, or the creator of all worlds in Buddhism, and so it doesn't count as Brahman, or the supreme being. So if that's the sense in which the Ajivikas were labeled as atheists by other Indian religions, it doesn't necessarily mean they didn't believe in any gods, but it at least meant they did not believe in Brahman, or the supreme being. Despite the fact that they believed that beings had a fate and their actions, in a sense, were powerless to change when they would attain freedom from samsara, the Ajivikas did practice a very strict form of renunciation or asceticism. They did not wear clothes, they shaved their heads, and they had no material possessions. You can see a statue of an Ajivaka on the right, which is part of a larger Buddhist piece from ancient India, but it's believed to show an Ajivaka. By the way, the not wearing of clothes is something that many Jain monks practice too in the Digambara sect of Jainism. So the Ajivikas were not unique in this respect. And in general, even among other Shramanas, such as Buddhists and the Hindu Shramanas, they didn't tend to go completely in the nude, but they might have very few clothes, like just a loincloth, or very simple clothing. So they practice other types of renunciation. Now let's get to the Upanishads themselves. These were the texts written by the sects of Shramanas that were still Hindu, i.e. that still acknowledged the Veda. The Upanishads are actually classified as part of the Veda, the fourth and the last part. Many of them claim to give deeper interpretations of Vedic rituals, for example. The word Upanishad probably means connection in the sense of a secret or hidden connection between things. So they're claiming to give a deeper layer of meaning behind either things in the Veda or things that we perceive in daily life. So an example of the former is the horse sacrifice, which is performed by a king once during their reign, according to the Veda, to give themselves prosperity and success, is reinterpreted in the first of the Upanishads, known as Brihadaranyaka, as a Shramana's sacrifice of all of their attachments to the world. So each part of the horse that's being sacrificed is symbolically linked to another part of the world that the Shramana is renouncing any claim or attachment to. And instead of ensuring worldly success of a king, sacrificing your attachments to the world is supposed to give you the blessing of moksha, or liberation, which in the Upanishads is interpreted as union with Brahman, or the supreme being. A second sense in which the Upanishads contain secret or hidden connections is that between perceptible phenomena. So one example of this is the doctrine of the Upanishads that behind all the separate selves that we perceive in different humans, in different animals, and in different other kinds of beings on other spiritual levels, such as gods, angelic beings, hell beings, etc., they actually have one true self, one cosmic self behind all of them, which can basically be identified with God or the Supreme Being. Another example of this is in the doctrine of three gunas, or elemental qualities, that we find the beginnings of in some of the Upanishads. So this would posit that there are these invisible elemental qualities, or gunas, present as parts of many of the objects that we see, even though we don't directly perceive them. For example, one of the gunas is called rajas. It's associated with passion, with fire and energy, and it would be present in lots of different kinds of things, such as actual literal fire, but also in spicy foods, perhaps, for example. Let's draw a distinction between the Upanishads and another strand of Hinduism, or Vedic religion. Brahmanism is a term used for the religion based on the original Veda, as it had developed in the late Vedic period and after. So it's similar to the early Vedic religion that existed in the early Vedic period from around 1500 to 1100 BCE. But the form of Vedic religion practiced later is often called Brahmanism, named after the Brahmins or priests who are its main focus. So Brahmanism is mainly based on the Veda, and it focuses on Vedic rituals and sacrifices to honor the gods or devas. The Upanishads have a different goal and different ways of practicing the religion. So they emphasize meditation and austerities as opposed to ritual, for attaining the goal of moksha as opposed to attaining this worldly success or just a good rebirth, which are the main goals of Brahmanism. Now the Upanishads, because they are Hindu texts, they don't deny the Veda. They do regard the Vedic rituals as producing blessings in samsara. So if you pray or sacrifice to the gods, they will reward you. But these rituals will not lead to moksha or liberation from samsara. So in a way, they're a kind of lesser level of wisdom or a lesser level of teaching in some sense. Although the Upanishads do purport to find their own doctrines, you might say, hidden or underneath the surface of the early Veda itself. To be clear, there are some predecessors or antecedents to the Upanishads in the early Veda. Brahman, the supreme being, is talked about, for example, and there is mention made of long-haired ascetics of the sort that would be in the Shramana movement in the later hymns of the Rig Veda. So another innovation, though, of the Upanishads and the Hindu Shramana movement is that there was some variability in terms of the caste and gender of the Shramanas or other people involved in the Upanishads. Most Shamanas, it's true, were indeed male Brahmins, the same people who dominated the Brahmanist form of Hinduism. However, some Shramanas were male Kshatriyas, so it was more common to have non-Brahmins, even potentially as important teachers among the Shramanas. Buddhism, for example, was founded by Siddhartha Gautama, who was a Kshatriya, not a Brahmin by birth. There's also the case of two famous female Kshatriyas or nobles in the oldest Upanishad, Brihadaranyaka, named Gargi, Vachaknavi, and Maitreyi. And they actually interview different Brahmins and test their wisdom. And Gargi, Vachaknavi, and Maitreyi come out as basically being wiser than the mainly ritualist Brahmins that they're interrogating or having a dialogue with. So it shows you that there is a bit more diversity in terms of caste and gender among the influential figures of the Upanishads authors than of Brahmanism. The picture on the right is of a modern Hindu sannyasin or sadhu. You can see that he has very long hair and dreadlocks. It's common for Shramanas to not cut their hair or beard as a type of renunciation. So instead of styling it or going to the barber, which would be a kind of worldly attachment to your appearance, they just let it grow naturally. So we've talked about the doctrine of karma already, but let's give it a little bit more detail. The literal meaning of the word karma is action. It refers to a cosmic law that links actions with results for the being who acts. The way karma is conceived, it does not have to be actively policed or enforced by God or by the gods, the devas. It's just the way the world works. So for example, if you are generous to someone else, that act of good karma will tend to produce a like result for you in the future. Someone else will be generous to you, either later in this life or in a future lifetime. So good and bad karma are reliable ways of producing good or bad results for yourself. And your karma also conditions the circumstances of your next birth. So if you are a very generous or wise or just person, you may be reborn as a higher caste individual or even as a superhuman individual such as a god or other celestial being. The gods or devas are themselves still subject to karma. So even though the gods are in a better position than humans, they have much longer lives, they're more powerful, they experience more pleasure, and they also tend to have a bit more knowledge or virtue than the average human. They are not supremely wise, they're not completely free of samsara, unlike Brahman. So Brahman is the supreme being that's originally mentioned in the early Veda, but the theory of Brahman is much more developed in the Upanishads. Samsara is the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth of souls, and this is also involving reincarnation. So reincarnation literally means re-embodying. The idea is the same soul is reborn into different bodies. Your next life could be a different sex or gender, a different caste, a different species of beings even, such as a wolf, a donkey, a horse, or even a spiritual being like a god or demon. Even though, as mentioned, this involves a type of unending life, it's still regarded as a bad thing, a trap for souls, both because your future life will involve death and loss eventually, and because each time you're reborn, you're limited to that particular place and that particular time and that particular body or form. You don't have the freedom of movement of moksha as it's put in the Upanishads. So the early Upanishads have a cosmology or theory of the worlds of rebirth that is a little sketchy. It appears to be similar in broad outline to the Trilokya or three worlds of the earlier Veda. So there's a place or a plane of existence where the gods, the devas, live that's called heaven or Svarga. There's a kind of middle world or middle realm where humans and animals live. And then there's Yamaloka, the land of the dead, or kind of underworld realm. Later Hindu texts, such as the Dharma Shastras and Puranas, would create much more detailed cosmologies, but the early Upanishads cosmology retains this three-part structure, and it's not exactly precisely defined. As mentioned, the devas are still trapped in samsara, so even though they're gods, and they're still worthy of worship in some sense, Brahman is the absolutely free being, the supreme being, the one you should mainly be focused on. There's actually an analogy to samsara from ancient India with the Snakes and Ladders board game. This game was invented in India, and it's purely random, but it involves it's like a race game, and you roll the die, and that's the number of spaces you move. If you've never played this before, if you land on a ladder, you go up. If you land on a snake, you slide down. It's also called chutes and ladders in the United States. This game is an analogy for samsara because most beings who are trapped in samsara are ignorant of the law of karma. So it's not that they're necessarily continually going up or continually going down. They tend to bounce around from greater to lesser rebirths in an almost random or seemingly random fashion. It's only if you look at the big picture carefully that you understand the law of karma. So the good actions will take you to better rebirths. The bad actions, the bad karma will take you to worse rebirths. But because most beings are ignorant of this law or don't act upon it successfully, even if they get a good rebirth in the next life because of their generosity or virtue, they're likely to follow that up with a lower rebirth. So the gods aren't necessarily just one step away from attaining moksha. They could be just setting themselves up for a fall to a lower realm of rebirth. Samsara literally means a wandering on, and it has this kind of random quality to it. Tapas means, or often is interpreted as warmth or heat. So it's a metaphor for burning away spiritual impurities through renunciation. It's also definable as austerities or asceticism. So these are all concepts of spiritual discipline. Renunciation, giving things up for the sake of a spiritual goal. There are many types of tapas. Here are some examples. They could include ethical principles such as ahimsa or non-violence. The Upanishads has a similar view to what we saw in Jainism. Any violence or killing of living creatures is a sin. It's very bad karma that will keep you trapped in samsara. You will probably go to hell or have some other really bad rebirth as a result of killing. And this applies to animals, not just to humans. So not all Hindus are vegetarians. Many are, and specifically the Shramanas would have practiced strict non-violence. Brahmacharya means the supreme sacrifice, and it refers to giving up sex. Sex is often regarded as the source of the most intense physical pleasure that you can have in samsara, at least as a human birth. And so the supreme sacrifice would be giving up sex. So this is something that is not practiced by Brahmins in Hinduism. Brahmins can have wives and families, but Shramanas, if people choose that path, they are giving up sex. It's regarded as inconsistent with attaining moksha because it will keep you attached to the pleasures of the world. And there are other types of renunciation kind of along that theme, like giving up wealth, possessions, access to fine foods and wines, etc. is all part of tapas. Another type of tapas is asana, which means posture or position, specifically retaining one position for a long amount of time. So just standing, sitting, or even lying down in a specific unmoving posture. This is both a form of discipline, of renunciation, but also is regarded as providing a kind of stable platform for meditation. So the less you move around, the easier it is to get your mind into concentration. Now, an interesting bit of history is there was a mission of Greek philosophers that went with the armies of Alexander the Great to India in ancient times. And there's a report of one of them that observed some Indian philosophers they called gymnosophistae, or naked philosophers, that were practicing these asanas for long periods. So that was in the 4th century BCE. I think that's the first historical record we have of this type of renunciation, but it had probably been going on for many centuries before that. And samadhi means meditation or concentration. It can be on a wide variety of themes or topics, but common ones include the breath, which is called prana in Sanskrit, or a mantra like the sacred syllable Om. And you can see the picture on the right, the sadhu or sannyasin is practicing an asana or posture. The view of moksha or liberation in the Upanishads is similar to that of the other sects of Shramanas. It involves freedom from samsara. However, one of the distinctive aspects of all these different sects is exactly how they interpret moksha and how to attain it. Moksha in the Upanishads is interpreted as union with Brahman, or the Supreme Being. This is unlike the view of moksha in Jainism, Ajivikism, or Buddhism. So only the Upanishads composers and the Hindu Shramanas believe in Brahman, or this supreme all-powerful being. And specifically, they have this belief of your true self, your true Atman or self, as being the same as Brahman, or the supreme being. That's illustrated in the picture on the right, where we have a Shramana meditating, and you can see in the middle of his chest an image or icon of God. Specifically, this is showing Vishnu. This is a Hindu devotional text. That image of Vishnu would not have been around in the time of the Upanishads. It's from a later period of Indian history, but it does show you the concept of this true self, or this divine being, Brahman, being inside your own being if you just look carefully enough. This is also expressed by the phrase tat tavam asi in the Upanishads, which means you are that. That, or tat, refers to Brahman, the supreme being. You, or tavam, refers to Atman, yourself. So the state of moksha is experienced as perfect being or reality, what's most real, as perfect consciousness or complete awareness, and as complete bliss without suffering. Moksha can be attained in this life. So it's unlike heaven as it's ordinarily conceived in religions such as Christianity and Islam. Christianity and Islam conceive of heaven as an afterlife, another world or another kingdom, or perhaps as a kingdom to be established on earth, but at a future time. And the idea of many Christians, for example, is that even if you are saved because of Jesus, you don't experience the complete state of blessedness until a later time. That's different from Hinduism. The similarity is they do have a theory of salvation and an exalted state, which for Hinduism is moksha. However, moksha can be experienced in this very life if you attain the knowledge of your true self, or of Brahman. Also, moksha is something that you cannot necessarily easily attain in one lifetime. So that's also different from the theory of salvation of religions like Christianity and Islam, according to which you only have one life to live before God's judgment. In Hinduism, because of the theory of reincarnation, you're going to be reborn again and again until you're able to attain moksha. So it can be a gradual process of gaining knowledge and purifying the soul, potentially over many lifetimes before you perfect things. As long as you have even one sin or selfish thought inside your heart, you're not going to be in the state of moksha. And once attained, though, the state of moksha continues forever, including after the death of your last body. After your last body dies, your soul does not get reborn in samsara, it's just in a state of perpetual union with Brahman. Let's talk a bit more about Brahman. The name literally means supreme, and it can be interpreted as the supreme being, i.e. God. Brahman is regarded as the ultimate creator of this universe and its gods, as well as of other universes, potentially. Those are actually discussed in later Hindu texts. Brahman is described as neti neti in the Upanishads, which can be translated as not this or not that. It's stating that you can't describe him in terms of particular characteristics. He's neither big nor small, black nor white, male nor female, human or non-human, etc. Brahman is the cause of all of these different properties that can be observed in the world, but he himself or it himself transcends them. Another way of expressing the transcendence of Brahman is the idea of nama rupa, name and form. Nama rupa is a technical term in Indian religion and philosophy. Nama refers to words or names, and it has the connotation of what you can understand about the world through verbal description. Rupa means form or shape, and it has the meaning or connotation of what can be perceived through the senses or can be imagined about the world. Brahman has neither name nor form. You cannot define him verbally or rationally. You cannot perceive him with the senses. So he's this kind of invisible but all-powerful being or reality that's kind of behind the world of name and form. So he's the creator of name and form. In some sense, that's a part of him, but he's not limited to it. He goes beyond it. There's also a doctrine, though, of some actual properties of Brahman. These properties are abstract or intangible, imperceptible, so they're still beyond name and form. The first property is satya, which could be translated as being, reality, or truth. It's the notion that Brahman is whatever is supremely real, because he's the first cause. Chitta means consciousness or awareness, so Brahman is often conceived of as pure awareness without object. His awareness is unlimited, not restricted to one particular object, but rather completely free. And ananda, or bliss, is the sort of mental state or experience of Brahman. So Brahman does not experience any type of lack, suffering, or limitation, unlike all the beings in samsara. So the soteriology, or theory of salvation of the Upanishads, is that jnana, or knowledge of Brahman, is the state of liberation or moksha. And you can't just know this stuff intellectually or theoretically. You have to experience it as a living reality. Atman is a word for self in Sanskrit. It literally could mean body, at least originally, but in the Upanishads it's used to refer to your mind or your true self. The Atman, in the sense of the cosmic or universal self or soul, can be distinguished from the Jiva or Jiva Atman, which is the individual self. According to the Upanishads, your true self is the Atman. You could think of that as kind of like the soul of the world, or God in his innermost nature. Your true self is not your individual Jiva, so that includes your mind, but also your body. Your true self is neither your physical shape, nor even your thoughts, emotions, or memories. This is quite distinct from Christianity and Islam, for example, which do regard a true self separate from the body. That's the soul, typically, depending upon the type of Christianity or Islam. But they don't regard your individual soul as being without characteristics. In Hinduism, at least in the Upanishads, your true self, your Atman, is not what we think of as your individual mind or consciousness. The individual mind is based on illusion. It's trapped in samsara. Your true self is basically one with God already. You're just deluded about that fact. There's a term often used in Hinduism, Maya, which means illusion. This is defined differently by different sects and schools of Hinduism, but the main theme of the Upanishads is that there's an illusion that your individual self, your jiva, is the true self, when in fact your true self is Brahman. This can be expressed by the equation Atman, or self, equals Brahman, supreme being. Another set of terms that are related to this concept are Purusha and Prakriti. Purusha is a term also used in the early Veda. It literally means person, but it was used for a creator god. Prakriti can be defined as matter. However, both of these terms have a technical meaning in Hinduism. Purusha is usually conceived of as just pure awareness or pure consciousness, and Prakriti is everything that consciousness can perceive, every object of consciousness. So it includes not just physical matter in the ordinary sense, but even things like particular emotions or thoughts or words or memories that you can be aware of as objects in your mind. This distinction is introduced in the Upanishads, but it's developed much more systematically by a school of Hindu philosophy known as Sankhya, which we'll cover in a later video. Finally, let's look at the concept of Om. This has multiple interpretations, even in Hinduism. It's a sacred syllable or mantra that's often chanted in meditation. One interpretation of Om that's very influential is given in the Mandukya Upanishad. This also shows you an example of the diversity of topics and ideas included in the Upanishads. The Upanishads were authored over a period of several centuries, and some of them reflect inconsistent teachings even. For example, some of the Upanishads are more theistic than others. They conceive of Brahman as more of a personal god who's not truly identical to the individual soul, whereas the earlier Upanishads place greater emphasis on the unity between the individual self and the supreme being, and they tend to conceive of Brahman in more purely transcendent or abstract terms. In the Mandukya Upanishad, the mantra Om is analyzed in terms of 4 different worlds or levels of reality. The word Om is actually a contraction of 3 different letters in Sanskrit. A, U, and M is their transcription into English or the Roman alphabet. And this is because the letters A and U in Sanskrit, if they occur together, they form a diphthong, which is pronounced O. But originally, you could analyze the word as having 3 sounds, A, U, and So according to the Mandukya Upanishad, the A part of Om refers to the waking world, the world of ordinary waking consciousness, as it's called by modern psychologists. This is the world of the senses as we perceive it in ordinary life. And it includes our body and all other objects that we perceive, and also the contents of our own mind. U is a deeper world or level of being that's compared to the world of dream. So this is a world, you might say, of images or things created by the mind itself as opposed to coming into it from outside. And is compared to the state of dreamless sleep. So this is when you're still alive, but you have no perceptions. And this is regarded as a deeper world than either the world of dream or the waking world. So as we go through these numbers, we're getting closer to the world of Brahman, which is the supreme reality. Brahman does not correspond to any of the sounds of the word Om, but rather to the silence that surrounds the world. And that's a metaphor for the fact that Brahman is not directly perceptible. Brahman is not manifest in Samsara or in the creation. Brahman is, you might say, behind, above, or beneath the creation. So it's invisible to the senses, but it is potentially perceptible by an enlightened being. So one thing about this analysis of the word Om is it suggests that there's different levels of reality that correspond to different levels of consciousness. This particular analysis into four worlds or 4 states of being is not necessarily authoritative among all Hindus, but the idea of different levels of consciousness corresponding to different types of perceptions of reality is something that's very influential in Hinduism. So one way of defining different beings in samsara is that they're at different levels of consciousness and perceiving different levels of reality. And the goal is to actually attain union with Brahman, which transcends all of those particular states. The image on the right is actually just the Sanskrit form of Om, well, in the Devanagari script.